I'm Nida. I'm a user experience designer and a user researcher. I do a dual role. So one day I could be doing research based on science and using the scientific method and a grounding in psychology. Some days we could be doing playtests to see if the game is fun, engaging, usable or accessible. Other days it could be speaking directly with players and learning about their interests and motivations. Then it will be my job to translate all that data into something that the developers can use to empower themselves and create amazing designs that enhance the player experience. Since I've graduated, I've worked at studios like Well Played Games. Currently, I'm at NetSpeak Games. We're working on a cute, wholesome social MMO title, and I'm really excited about it. Learning from the players, what excites them about games gets me really excited to make better games and make stuff that people will love.
Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Catherine, and I'm delighted to be interviewing Nida Ahmad, who is a UX designer in games. She's worked on titles such as Warhammer Combat Cards, and is currently working at NetSpeak Games. I guess, could you explain a little bit about your job as a UX designer? Describe your role a little bit and what that looks like within the games project.
So a UX designer's job kind of varies depending on the size of the studio that you go to and how big your team is and things like that. So at the moment I work at NetSpeak Games, which is roughly just over 20-person studio. So my role is fairly general there as a UX person. So I cover UX design and user research. So user research generally involves figuring out who the player is, what types of games are they playing, what are they struggling with when it comes to like similar games or generally in the market, and what are they looking for in a future game? So this is to understand like if we're going for the right target audience and we're going for the right market fit. So that part of the role can be fairly market research heavy, but also it's about unpacking like the problem space, right? So like if players are going to play this type of game that we're making, what problems are they going to face in terms of like accessibility? Or what types of features would they be looking for, and help the team, like from a business side and a design side, unpack a lot of that. And then from a UX design perspective, I might design a lot of the solutions. Like this is where you see a lot of the wireframing in the UI work going in. So like when a designer comes to me with a new feature idea, I'll unpack the feature spec with them. So very much thinking about the user's needs, right? Because someone needs to fight for the player's voice in that situation. So I'll be asking things like, well, how does the player interact with this feature? What bits of UI are needed? What bits do we need to teach explicitly, especially like through a tutorial and things like that? And also asking like, is UI the right way to convey your design intent, right? Because you can teach players lots of things through the art and the level design and things like that. So it's making key decisions around that. And then when I've wireframed something, we'll then play test it like with our users. So we'll send them a build and get their feedback on it. And then I'll work with our producer to then prioritize a lot of the problems that come out. So it's kind of a constant loop of like doing some research on our users, unpacking the problem, coming up with a solution, testing it, and then just constantly going through that. So it's fairly broad at NetSpeak, whereas somewhere else it might be a bit more specific. When it comes to that.
Yeah, because I always thought that maybe in my head, like a UX designer would work quite closely with someone who's doing the kind of UX graphic design, but also someone who's doing the UI, like that kind of flow. But I guess do you like work with like the game designers as well, almost? Like, is that kind of, did that link a lot?
Yeah, so usually because we're working in mobile, like understanding and a good relationship with the product manager is really important. Because they'll be really focused on things like our KPIs, right? Like retention, how many people are churning and things like that. So they'll have their insight as well in terms of like, well, how can we improve the design of this feature? And this is how we want the metrics to change. And it's coming up with solutions in that way. But I might also work with artists in terms of talking about, is this the right color palette? Like, for example, are you aware of like red and green color blindness? Or, if you've created this NPC, is it readable that they are meant to represent XYZ personality, for example? And then with programmers, it might just be like a big thing I've learned this year is just understanding their job better. So like, what are their technical restraints? because I could have like the perfect UX solution for a design problem, but if we don't have the tech in place, or it's going to cause more problems, then we can't really do that, and we need to adjust the course that we go through. So I think a big part of the job is just learning how other people work, and working with their flow as well.
Wow, yeah. Like, do you ever kind of like find, because obviously like you're thinking about the kind of user first, right? And I guess a game designer would be thinking about the user as well, but like, I guess in different ways. Is there ever like a kind of like, not just with game designers, but I guess with artists as well, like anyone in the team, is there ever a kind of moment where you kind of have butt heads, or you have to kind of like negotiate a solution that works for both of you?
Yeah, I think this is where the relationship with tech is really, really important. So one way I try to solve this is figuring out what do we need for like the MVP of this feature, right? That is essential for the user in order for them to engage with it and understand what's happening, and also for it to be enjoyable for them. So that and then also work with the tech designer or the program to see what do we need as a base in terms of the tech, and then what can we build on later in the coming months, so that it doesn't overload their work, but also we understand like how this feature will evolve. Like, because especially I work at a startup, like what I think the feature is now is going to be very different to what it is in a month.
Oh, really? Okay.
So I can have like key ideas of what I want it to be in the future, but I've also got to focus on the now with the tech team, and then see how it evolves with time.
Oh, really? And then so you kind of have to kind of play test and kind of chop and change that stuff as it goes along. Okay, cool.
Yeah, play testing is a really huge part of it. And so we do a lot of internal play tests, but I also encourage a lot of external play testing with our target audience, because the way they play the game is very different to how we as developers will engage with it and understand it, right? Especially if you're not the target audience. And I always say to developers, you're never the target audience, even if you feel like the same demographics as them, because a consumer isn't usually coming at it with the same type of game dev mindset, or at least that level of literacy, right? And their intent with the game is different. They just want to chill and hang out. Yeah. So that should be the priority. Like, yeah. That's
I just wanted to mention to the audience that there will be a Q&A at the end. So if there's any questions that you have about this UX design chat, then feel free to like start asking those now. Like, is there a game that particularly you're particularly proud of working on, or that a piece of like UX design that you're particularly proud of and want to boast about? Or
I mean, a lot of it's under NDA. You know how game development is, right? A lot.
If you talk about it for like 5 minutes, we'll just bleep it out, and we can pretend you spoke about it.
I think the current one I'm working on, actually, because for me, like I've worked on a couple of games before, but this is the first time where I'm like the only UX person. So I'm making a lot of key decisions, and in some feature discussions, not all, I'm like a stakeholder. And it's really weird being in that side of the thing where like people have to pitch solutions and ideas to you. But what makes me proud about that is like helping people do their job better. I don't know if that's super cheesy, right? But like, especially with our UI designers, like they're incredible at what they do. But I do spend a lot of time with them, like helping them think about the feature that they're designing from a UX perspective. So I might give them like new resources and tools to do that, or I might ask them certain questions to like guide their thinking. I never tell people like you should do X, Y, Z, because again, I don't want to get in the way of their process. Right, but I do want to give them support mechanisms to get there and come to a solution that they're happy with, but also had like the creative space. And like I don't want to give people that pressure, right?
Yeah. No, I like
especially
that
when they're artists, right? That's the thing. You can't.
Yeah, I like that way of working as well. I don't really like to tell people how they should do, because I think especially in games as well, like we all do things really differently. And even if you see someone working in a certain way, even if it's not the way you would do it, you kind of have to grit your teeth a little bit, because you know that their way of doing it is the best way for them, kind of thing. And yeah.
Also, it just helps in the long term, right? Like if people are happy and content with the way they're working. And it's very collaborative. like it's going to be better for the game and the team overall, rather than someone coming in and telling you what to do.
Yeah, right.
That helps no one, right?
Also, artists, as I know, are very stubborn. I'm talking for myself. So, like, I guess, like, do you have? Because I never look at games and think about the kind of UX. I sometimes do, but like very rarely do I think about the kind of UX of it. But obviously, it's very smart. Like, what is there any kind of games out there at the moment that you kind of like take inspiration from, or like has impressed you in terms of their UX design?
I think so. When I was preparing for this, it's actually really hard to pick one game, and I think a lot of that comes down to because when you talk about UX design, that in itself is really broad.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Because it's like heavily connected to game design. It's also connected to like art and UI and things like that. It also depends of like what goal you're going for with your UX as well, right? Because of course you have the base thing of like it being functional and usable, but also like what type of experience do you want to create? Like, is it really fast paced and exciting, or is it something much slower like Animal Crossing? But the ones that I wrote down were Genshin. Genshin's a really huge game. Genshin Impact.
Genshin Impact, yeah.
So art wise, it's amazing, but experience wise, it's a very like heavy game in terms of like things you need to track, and just the information that you need to collect. But they have like really digestible menus that you can go through, that are big on like imagery, and there's not too heavy on text. Like it still takes some time to learn, but the game allows you to experiment with the menus and like try your own ways of interacting with them.
Wow, that's cool.
But also generally when you're playing, at least on mobile, I really enjoy like the input mechanism. So like you generally use a joystick and things like that, but it feels very smooth, right? And that's probably from like tech decisions and things like that.
Right.
But it feels like you're actually running without any bumps and things like that. And you can, when you tap on something to interact with it, the VFX feedback and like the particle feedbacks that you get feels really satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really small things like that I really enjoy. And like Hades is a really good example of that, right? That game feels so good to play.
Yeah.
And I can completely understand why. Like you can see like from a tech and an art perspective, like they really thought about this in detail. And it also shows you that like UX isn't really owned by one person. It's shared by so many different people in the team.
Yeah.
Because even that art and UI work in Hades, like they had to think about what type of player they're making the game for, and how do they want to feel at each stage of a game, right?
Yeah.
So Hades has been a big one for me this year anyway.
I still haven't played it. I need to play it. Yeah, it's on my list. I think whenever people mention it to me, I go, oh, yeah, it's a really good game. But like I so many people speak about it all the time, and I would love to play it. Cool. So what was your path? I've read up about it a little bit about it, but I'd love you to go into it. Like what, like your path into UX design. Like talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so for me, I had no intent of working in games or UX before I joined. Like a lot of people, I kind of fell into the industry. But specifically what that meant was I was studying psychology at university.
Mm-hmm. That's cool.
Right next to Leamington Spa, which is a huge games hub. And at the time I was looking for work to balance, my studies and like get through university and things like that. And I found an internship at a game dev studio, and they just happened to be looking for someone with a psychology background to help them with their design decisions.
Oh, that's amazing.
So I was really, I completely understand how lucky I was in that situation. Like, I'm not going to minimize the privilege I had with that. But my internship then turned into a part-time job and then full-time job at that company. But even though I had no game dev experience, I was still able to come in and help with the design. So one of the first projects I did was a market research project. Again, that's just because of my skill set and where my strengths lie. So helping them define their audience better, but also did another presentation around this is how you can use psychology for better game design.
Yeah.
And the way I did that was I was actually not a big gamer. I didn't really play games much then, but I was able to spend time with quite a few games of like their competitors and things like that, and just breaking down the design decisions that were made. So finding like the common patterns for good experience design, which is a really cool thing about game UX, right? Is like you don't really need to be a huge gamer initially anyways, but you should be able to have like a good analytical mind.
Yeah.
And solving a lot of problems that you see arise. Like it's very solution driven, but also understanding the problem space that you're in are two core areas of that.
And I imagine like psychology, I find it amazing that it kind of makes so much sense that you would have studied psychology before going into UX. Like, I guess that definitely would put you in the mind of the kind of user experience and that kind of thing. But like, what is there like any kind of real examples where your psychology degree like came into massive, like really helped you basically in your UX? Like, would you also recommend that people study psychology going into UX?
Yeah, I mean, when I recommend studying it, right, it doesn't have to be a university degree. You can watch YouTube videos online. There's a bunch of books out there about psychology and UX design. So there's always different areas you can get started from. I think a big thing for me was just learning about unconscious biases and how irrational people are, right? Like we see ourselves as very logical and straight thinking, but not really. So at university, we used to do a lot of internal research projects, like just as a yearly thing. And I learned a lot around just how do you set up a good study. So so if you have someone come in and like as a participant, how do you make sure like the room is not influencing the decisions in any way or how they talk to you? So that translates a lot into like how do you set up a proper playtest? So if someone's coming into like your studio in the building, assuming we're not remote anymore, how do you set up the testing room so that they don't see things like posters on the wall that will impact how they view your game, for example?
Oh my God, that's so interesting. Yeah.
Or like, how do you talk to them in a way that doesn't make them feel intimidated, right? So like something I generally avoid is not having the CEO in the room, for example, because you don't want the person feeling worried and things like that, even though the CEO wants to see how it is and they want to introduce themselves. What I've done as an alternative is say, either like ask the person if it's okay, this person listens in, but isn't in the room, or just give some notes back to my team after. Or what I've done at NetSpeak when I've been running interviews and stuff is I've had people from my team on the call, but like muted more or less. So they're just listening and they don't have any input. So just being aware of like how people respond to different situations, especially in the playtest, right? Because they don't know you and they're just here to play a game. And you never want them feeling uncomfortable or like anything's their fault. Or
do you almost want it to feel clinical in a way, or is that a bit cold?
Somewhat depends on what type of testing you're doing. Yeah, I mean, I always try to be open and personable, right? I think that's still important, so they be comfortable. But like something I'll never do is when they ask me whilst they're playing, like assuming I've given them all the instructions, is if they say to me, hey, I'm stuck, what do I do? I tend not to tell them, at least initially, what they need to do, because I want to see how they solve the problem, right? And why is it that they're facing that problem in the first place? Because that's a really good insight for us as a team.
Yeah.
Like, why was this a hurdle for the player?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go on. Carry on. I was going to. I'm terrible when I've play tested games like at events or like I'm terrible. Like as soon as I meet like a situation I can't handle, I often will basically back out straight away and ask someone if they can help me. So yeah, I think when there's someone there and you can just ask them, like I'm just a lot less patient.
Yeah, but I mean, the goal at the end is like also reminding the player, like we are not testing you, we are testing the game. So if you struggle with anything, that's not your fault. And ensuring people are reminded of that.
Yeah.
is super important.
It's so interesting that you said that kind of like, you know, having the CEO in the room can affect the results. Because I can imagine if you have, say, the game designer or like the boss of the company there watching you play the game, you're not going to want to like say bad things about their baby, basically, because they'll be there watching. Has there been like any kind of like, I guess this is kind of an odd question, but have you had to explain to like a CEO or something like you just can't be there because it would affect the results?
Not in a playtest directly, but like when there's recruitment going on.
Yeah.
For like participants and stuff, I generally tell anyone in leadership, like, let me send the email, not you, because if they see your email signature, people are going to freak out.
Wow.
So it's even in communications, like before the playtest, you've got to think about, it's not just about the playtest itself. There's like a lot of communication you have with that player way before, right? Through the emails, signing them up, and then also the debrief afterwards. So there's a whole process and pipeline to it. It's fairly long.
That's so interesting. Do most UX designers have like kind of a background in psychology? Are you kind of like unique to that?
No. I don't want to say I'm unique. That's such a weird. No, I'm definitely not unique. It depends. Like I've met UX designers of so many different backgrounds, right? Like I've seen game designers that have gone into UX. I recently met quite a few QA people who moved into UX. You don't need lots of game dev experience. You just need an understanding of games. So I think as long as you understand like who your players are, and also like develop that UX mindset. Like I do think there is some scientific element to it, but not in an academic way. If you're able to pick up some of the relevant skills, I think anyone can with time learn to do the job.
Yeah. Cool.
And it's also a really big and growing field in our industry, right? It's still relatively new compared to how it is in tech. But what UX means in games is shifting all the time. Because I think traditionally people have like conflated it with UI design, for example.
Yes.
And then other times people have thought UX design is just the wireframes. So like I'm a UX designer who barely does any wireframes, but I spend a lot of time on like what's our strategy, what's our process, planning for like potential problems that are going to come up and things like that. So there's definitely different specializations within UX.
Wow. So you are a founding member of People of Color in Play.
Excuse me.
And so what was the story there? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, so, oh God, it's going to be 2 years this month. That's crazy. Adam Campbell and Chella Ramanan actually founded the organization after seeing like a regular pattern of underrepresentation of people of color within our industry. And they wanted to make a change for that, which is great. And then they both reached out to like select people within the industry that they felt like really wanted to make that change and are part of that value and mission for better inclusion and racial equity. And then it's just been going on from there. So I think it's about 10 of us now. About half of us are based in the UK, but there's some in Sweden, Germany, Tenerife as well. But all of us have had experiences where like we haven't felt included because of our racial backgrounds, or we've seen like some injustices in the industry, and like a lot of us know of how underrepresented people of color are. I think it's around 10% in the UK industry.
UK games industry. Yeah.
I think it's 10%. Someone can correct me. But it is fairly low around that. So the aim of Park and Play is just creating a lot of initiatives and events to helpfully solve that problem. And then at some point, we know it's worked because we won't be needed anymore.
Right. Yeah.
The problems.
Like what kind of things are you kind of putting in place at the moment to kind of improve that? So a big part of our thing was casual meetups before we went remote, which is something we want to start up again as well. But these are meetups for like people in the industry and people that want to get into the industry to meet up regularly. And we used to have someone from the industry come in and talk about their job so that people can learn about how it works, but also just about any game dev topic that they're really passionate about.
And these were like really relaxed environments, just because we understand like how stressful going to a game dev event can be, especially if you're really new to the industry.
Yeah.
And like ensuring that these events were fairly accessible. So we used to offer like a £200 travel bursary for our events as well. Because one thing we understand is like, though there's a problem with racial inclusion in the industry, it's also multi-layered, right? Like there's also issues of class, sexuality, disabilities, or that impact your experience as well. So we're trying to help people in those areas as well. We've also done like different masterclasses. We help people find work in the industry. So we do like CV and portfolio reviews. Some of the people on the team are actual mentors for some people. And we, Adam last year did for Black History Month, the BHM 100 tag on Twitter. So we highlighted 100 Black game devs in the industry, just to show like,
that's amazing.
There's people out there and there's the visibility out there, but also showing like the broad spectrum of roles and experiences that you can have and still be in the industry. And that was a really nice campaign just to see, because I found out about a lot more people that I didn't even know about.
Yeah.
And we say small, but also there's lots of people out there. And then going ahead, we have a few ideas that I can't talk about yet, but we're going to announce one tomorrow, hopefully. So good timing.
Yeah.
Specifically to bring the community together, especially with going remote. I think it's been hard for people to continue a lot of these conversations and find places where they can meet people like them. So
yeah, it's so true. And like, how do you feel like, I mean, all these things sound amazing, but like, how do you personally feel like it's going? Like, how do you feel about the diversity in the industry as it is? Because I mean, I'm sure it's definitely, at least since I started working, it's definitely improved a lot. Like it was much harder. Like I would definitely find it difficult to see a person of color working with me, basically. But now that's happening a lot more, which is lovely. But what's your thoughts on how it's going?
I think it's improving, but obviously there's a lot more. Like there's still a lot more to do, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I guess when it's 10%, it's definitely a lot more.
And also understanding, like I've been very lucky to be based in London, where the community is generally diverse, but not everyone has that. So I know I've had it again easier than a lot of other people have had. But I'm glad to see a lot of initiatives coming out, right? Like even we've got Ensemble for the past couple of years, which has been really useful for people to see people like us, and that there are people of color within the industry. I've seen a lot of mentoring programs and like scholarships and funding initiatives, at least in the past year, pop up. So people understand like, money is a huge resource and time is a huge resource. So I think there's progress, but there's definitely a lot more way to go, especially like talking about the nuance of it, I think is still like a next step for a lot of us.
Yeah, because it's easy to talk about it broadly, but like you say, there's all these pockets of extra stuff that is, and like particularly I've also grown up in London, so, and I think I agree, like I always think about that privilege, and the fact that I could live at home whilst I was looking for work and this kind of in London, and also being able to connect early with people, games industry people within London, right? And not having, like, imagine coming here from outside of London and having to like rush and network and, in a certain amount of time. We've kind of had that kind of flexibility to kind of sit back and take our time a little bit. I don't know if you've had that similar experience of living in London.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very lucky to like live at home, and like the only thing I've got to worry about is transport and food, right? Like going to an event and things like that. A huge thing for me also, just meeting other people of color, is like finding people of similar experiences to you, and people who speak like you or understand the world very similarly to you, right? Like there's a thing like I will say, like my proper accent comes out when I'm talking to people with similar background to me. Whereas in the workspace, it's slightly different.
It's strange, isn't it? I think I was in a workspace once and I heard the lick of a South London accent across the room, and I was like, oh, my people. And it was just like, and like I agree, like my accent kind of changed a little bit. Like I talk, maybe this is too revealing, but I definitely talk differently when I'm talking to someone from London. And it's like, yeah, you say like your proper accent, your real accent. And there's this kind of like unity you feel when you meet someone who's of a similar position to you. You mentioned, I think, in an article that I read somewhere that it's rare, like, to come across people of working class in the industry. And like, why do you think it's harder for the working class to enter the industry? Or do you think it's harder for the working class to enter the industry?
I think it's like there was the recent UK report, right? I think it's the census. And it says like of people in the games industry, about 62% came from homes where like their parents were in professional managerial backgrounds. So it's already indicating to you like this industry is fairly middle class or up class, depending on how you want to define it. Accessibility for working class people has been fairly hard. Where that's like even seeing games as an option, as a career option. Like it's not something I was told about at school. All I was told about was like, you know, doctors, lawyers, or like super high paying jobs, because it's the goal there is like, let's get you out of being working class, more or less was the messaging, right? And games wasn't seen as feasible because generally games are much lower paying than others, but the salaries are getting much better and I can live much more comfortably now. So I think it's also the lack of opportunity as a working class person is how do I find the time to develop games in my spare time if I'm working multiple jobs to get by?
Yeah, of course.
Or like, how do I take time out to interview for a thing if my test takes 2 or 3 days to complete? And it's being considerate of like people who are working class generally don't have the same amount of free time. They may not have the same amount of like money, but also like social and cultural capital, right? Like it's something you mentioned earlier was like connections. They're a huge part of getting into the games industry and also growing your career in the industry. So if you're based in London, it's much easier because of that. But if you're based somewhere up north where there might not be as many events, how are you going to connect with people? And Twitter can be very intimidating, at least when you're getting started. Like, how do I talk to people in the industry through that as well? It's definitely is too, I think.
I definitely like I've kind of used Twitter quite a lot, like early on, and I was kind of messaging people. But most of my main connections came from like real life and living in London, and just kind of accidentally meeting people through uni and this kind of thing. And so like that's like I can imagine it being incredibly difficult if you don't live in London. And you can't afford the means to kind of come here and stuff like that.
But I think that's the great thing about. Not great things, sorry. But like the fact that COVID has happened is that it's forced a lot of things to go remote. So it's opening the doors a little bit more, hopefully, of like having online remote events that are free so that anyone can join in at any time and can still network with each other. So hopefully we adapt in that way.
I don't mean to come back to the accent thing again. But it's something that's always interested me is that, you know, like the fact that you have to suppress your accent essentially in certain situations. But because do you think like having a certain kind of accent, like say like a very thick South London accent, can affect your opportunities? I guess this is a general career question as opposed to also a games industry question as well.
I mean, I have no idea. It depends on the context and the situations you're in, right? Like, I also know after being here for a few years, I am becoming more and more comfortable at using my normal accent. In the work environment and becoming more unapologetic, and more confident in just being myself. But I can see how some people might see it as a barrier. And I think that just comes down to hiring processes, right? Like how to ensure that they're very inclusive and they don't consider biases around accent, because it shouldn't be on you as an employee to change who you are.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the main thing.
Yeah.
I always say to people, still be yourself. Even though I moderate my accent sometimes, I am getting much better at it.
Yeah, like I definitely swear a lot more when I'm not being watched. I don't know if that's anything to do with accent. But yeah, okay, cool. It is, so you did your first ever conference last year. How was that experience?
That was really, really interesting. So like, it was one of my career goals to speak at that event within a couple of years of graduating. So being able to do that was like an amazing achievement for me. The great thing about speaking at conferences is just meeting other people who are interested in the same thing as you. So you can be nerdy for like a whole day and it's completely fine. Just talking about this one area. And learning a lot about like how other studios work is really cool. Like, how did they approach the same problem, or like what different ways have they like worked together to solve design problems and things like that. I really love conferences as a means to meet new people, but also get new forms of inspiration as well that I can apply to my own work.
Yeah, that's cool. That's awesome. Yeah, I've never really kind of done that myself, but I can imagine it being very fruitful in that way. Like, how many people was there at this conference?
It was a couple hundred at least. I'm not sure. It was a while ago. But no, it's also really scary and daunting because it was my first one. So I made sure it was a panel with people I trusted so that we could just have a casual conversation. But it still be useful for all the people listening and learning about UX. So like I did 2 talks actually. So one was on like UX processes. So like if you are joining a new studio as the sole UX person, how do you ensure like people start believing in UX and seeing the value in it? And then I did another talk with a good friend of mine where it was around how does game design and UX design work together? Because there's so many overlapping areas in both disciplines. And it's talking about how can we support each other in our work. Cool. Which was really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Before we move on to the Q&A questions, so guys, feel free to send tons of questions for Nida. What would your advice be for anyone new wanting to get into UX in games?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it?
Sorry.
It's fine. I don't think it's too different to a lot of, excuse me, wanting to get into like a lot of other different areas in the industry, right? It's figuring out why you want to do this role. Like, what is it that excites you? And then when you're interviewing, talk about that. Like, what do you love about it, and what contributions do you want to make to the job that you go for? But also just like get out there as well, like get your name out there. Like there aren't, again, like I said, game UX is fairly new. So there aren't actually lots of people within it right now. There are people like discovering it and trying to build their portfolio around it. So it's a really good time to get in. So I do some stuff around helping people with their CVs and portfolios. But also spend some time on Twitter. I know that's a hard one, and it's one that a lot of people give as like advice, but it's something that's helped me. It's the way I found a lot of opportunities, whether that's jobs or like speaking events and things like that. You really want to build relationships with people. And a lot of these people will end up becoming your friends as well, that you end up working with at some point, or, you know, just rely on for support. So I think showcasing your skill set and like what you're interested in through Twitter will be really helpful. So something I do is I just talk about UX a lot on Twitter. And in a way it works for me also because it pushes me to learn something new that I can tweet about, but also so it helps me learn develop my skills in that way. But also as a result, what I started doing was doing game UX breakdowns of interesting games like Overwatch and Fall Guys. So I'd end up writing like Medium articles about them, of like, this is why they're really good from a UX and UI perspective. I then post that on Twitter, and then the developers of that game retweet it, or like people who could potentially be hiring me retweet it.
Yeah.
So I'm always showing like new bits of work or something that showcases my skill on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Right. And that could be like a long article, which is a lot of work, or it could just be a couple of tweets about the industry and UX and things like that. So yeah, showing off who you are is like the main thing, so that people can actually see you, right? Like visibility is a huge thing.
Massively, yeah.
And competition is a huge thing as well. So it's making sure you stand out in that way. And the way I've done it is using social media.
Yeah. It's very kind of, I think social media is amazing for like marketing yourself massively.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just post a picture, but you kind of have to convince everyone with like amazing anecdotes about UX, and this is cool.
Right. Yeah, even with I was just going to say one more thing. It's just learning about if you want to do game UX, is understanding like how to work with people. And I know it's important for every job, but with game UX especially, like it's a very holistic, high level role. So often, depending again what studio you're at, you might not even be based directly in the development team. You might be external to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And your job would be going to each feature team or however the team's distributed, learning about those problems and having a high level overview of the common patterns and problems and helping people solve them.
Yeah.
So if you're able to show a good understanding of like game development process and just how messy it can be, that's something huge I've learned on this current job, is like there's lots of unplanned stuff that happens, is going to really help you, I think, in the long run. Definitely.
Cool. And like kind of hearing about you talk about UX, I've noticed that you talk about kind of larger teams. Like, do you see like a role for UX in kind of like smaller teams? Like, is there like a situation where, say, a UX designer could come in for a week and then just kind of look at the game and kind of give an overview, like, and then kind of leave? Or like what would an indie game scenario look like for a UX designer?
Yeah, so technically with NetSpeak we are like around 20 people, so it's fairly small there, but I've worked on even smaller teams before where I consulted for a couple months.
Right, cool.
So there it was, they would show me like, hey, this is our current game, can you help us with the UX, which is a really broad task to do. But my job there would be unpacking and identifying a lot of the key UX problems. So I'll use different UX methods and processes to find out what these issues are, as well as what they're doing right. Like, I think it's always really important as a UX person to show the team like, hey, you're actually doing really good at this one thing. Please continue doing this thing.
Yeah.
Because the players will really enjoy it. Because something I've seen developers do is sometimes they get bogged down in all the problems. And like some people might put themselves down, or they get worried about the state of the game.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. So I might use UX methods like heuristic evaluation, for example, or doing a playtest with users. And essentially, like heuristic evaluation is using like a set of guidelines or principles that you compare the game against to see if it's like usable. Does it give you the right types of feedback? Is it teaching things in the right way? And then doing a report on like highlighting these issues based on like what I think is the most important to solve right now. So like if you don't solve this thing, it's going to break the experience and the player will leave.
Right.
Or saying, hey, this might be an issue, but it doesn't like block progression, but they might feel a bit weird about the experience. And it might throw them off for a little bit. So there's like an element of production to that, right? Where you're prioritizing and triaging different issues that appear.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, I usually then design some solutions with wireframes or do some further research into, hey, these games are doing these things that you might want to look at to help you with the design. So when I consult, like I do come up with new design ideas through the wireframes, or I might give them some further resources. Mm-hmm. But essentially, the deliverable they get from me as a UX person is a really good report around the current state of the UX of the game, and then telling them how they can improve it, which is the main thing. But what I really like about that is because it's like smaller games, sometimes you can be a bit more experimental in like the methods that you use. So I think a lot of people worry that like you've got to be super academic when you do UX work, but no, you can come up with your own types of methods based on pre-existing methods.
Right. Yeah.
To come up with a solution, because the indie studio might have like a really small budget, or they might only have a week. So it's like, how do you unpack all the UX problems in that time if it's a fairly big game, for example? So your job as a UX person can very much vary depending on the size of game.
Yeah.
But there's always space for you to be giving feedback and helping them refine the experience for the user. So I always look at two key things, which is like, is the experience like usable, but also is it really engaging, right? So like, is it accessible? Do people learn what they got to do? Are they being taught appropriately? And then the second aspect of like engagement is like, are they paying attention to like key areas? I really always feel really weird about the word fun because it's such a broad word. But like in a general sense, are they enjoying their experience? And things like that. So there's lots of different prongs to the UX area, basically.
That's I just gone on a tangent. No, that was an amazing tangent. That's super interesting. I never thought about it that way, like, and how massively useful that would be as well. Like, because I've worked on a lot of independent games where we kind of haven't had someone who's specifically UX, and it would be nice for someone to come in and basically look at those problems and like solve them, because that would save about 20,000 meetings trying to come up with solutions. A lot of my time is spent in meetings asking these types of questions so that, you know, we can save time in the long run. So being good at communicating and talking to people is a huge part of the job. Yes.
But also helping people understand what that problem is. Because people might say, oh, this feature's broken. But it might be like, no, maybe the feature isn't broken, but the way you've taught it could be improved.
Oh, that's right. That's so cool.
So a bit of it is just framing the problem space.
Yeah.
Into something that the team understand better, and then they can work on.
Awesome. We've just got 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna go on to the Q&A. One of the questions was from anonymous attendee. In fact, they're all from anonymous attendees. How has remote working changed how you've approached your role?
Oh God, that's a huge one. So before remote, I used to do a lot of in-person workshops and just a lot of what I call like water cooler talk, right? Where you just talk and figure out like what you need to do and what problems we might be facing. So I've been using a lot of interactive whiteboards as a huge resource since going remote.
Right.
So what do I do? Sorry, my brain's gone off. But it might be like, if we're struggling with an actual problem, I'll write down the problem. I'll write down all the potential solutions that we have. I might write down all the inspiration sources that we have and just get everyone in a room and just talk about it so that we have an outcome and a list of decisions that we're happy with. And also I found that really good because NetSpeak has generally moved into remote working anyway. Like we've got people working from all over Europe and the UK. So we're all in different time zones. So the adjustment has been hard, but like having those online tools has been really useful for me. And it's also nice because I can just jump into a call with someone whenever need be. Whereas before it used to be like, well, if someone's not in the office today, then it's really hard to have that discussion.
Yeah.
And that's my main thing. Sorry.
Cool. I'm just waiting for some more questions to come in. So if you have questions, guys, then feel free to ask. I have a question which is related to I always do this. I go back to parts of the conversation that just happened. But like, do you prefer working in small teams or big teams, based on the fact that, you know, you can basically be more experimental in small teams? Like, what do you prefer? Like,
I don't think I have a preference yet because I haven't had the full spectrum yet. But what I do like about small teams is just how fast-paced the work is, but also how much I can get to know each person really well. Because we are fairly small, so I can spend a lot of time learning about someone else's process or what type of language they use. And I can help them more on a personal level when there are problems to solve or like solutions to design. And also that's kind of why I've chosen mobile for now, is because of how quick the development cycles are, right? It's very fast paced. So there's always new problems coming up that we've got to solve in like a week or two.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of challenges me in my creative way as well, because I am fairly like analytical and methodical as a person. So I get to grow my other skills in a different way.
Cool.
Yeah. Also, I just realized another thing I like about remote working is like how hands-on I can get. Sorry, I'm just going back to it. How hands-on I can get the rest of the team into like understanding UX and the UX process. So like when there's playtesting videos that come back from people playtesting our game, I kind of open up, I give the link to those videos to everyone. Mm-hmm. So everyone can watch those videos whenever they want. And there's already discussions happening around like key problems that are appearing, or I might create like video clips and GIFs showing people like the like key problems or interesting insights that appeared. So for me, it's really important to get people hands-on.
Yeah.
With my process, and I think remote has made that a lot more easier.
Right. Because
you can do things at their own time and own pace and still learn a thing. And then whilst they're looking through the videos, I can be writing my report and doing like the more serious analysis of it.
Right.
But already people are having their like beginning conversations about areas they want to work on next.
Cool.
And so they get to see the value of UX face to face, right? Because they get to watch the videos.
Is that something that's harder to happen in when you're not there in the kind of office, or?
No, I don't know if it's harder. It's just a different way of working.
Yeah.
Because I can just drop a link in Slack.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's very different. Whereas, like, if I was playtesting in person, which obviously has huge value, then I encourage it if you can. But like, if it's just me in the room, I can't really do too much, and people don't see as much. Like, there's a lot more. Like, people have to wait longer, or like I can just give a list of notes, but people can't see the actual experience of gameplay. So it's different. Yeah.
I have a question from Frankie. How do you look for playtesters outside of the company, and how do you become one? Thanks.
Thanks. So a lot of companies actually have it on their website that they're looking for playtesters. So that's usually one way you sign up, or through their Discord communities or social media. That's how I used to. So I used to do playtesting before I became a UX designer as well, and that's how I found out about it. And then when it comes to recruitment, we'll kind of go through those lists, and depending on the type of playtest we want to do, we will pick certain types of people, depending on what questions we want to answer with that playtest. So yeah, it varies.
Cool. I think we're going to be wrapping up now, because that's the end of the questions list. But thank you everyone for watching. It's been lovely to talk to you, Nida. And that was massively interesting. The next Ensemble Salon will be Nida interviewing Elle Osley-Wood. So keep an eye out and an eye on the London Games Festival Twitter for updates. Nida, where can people find you online?
Again, we already spoke about it, but Twitter is the main area. So I'm at Nida Ahmad _ on Twitter, and you're more than welcome to like ask me questions about UX, or if you've got a CV or portfolio, I'm happy to look it over and answer anything.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, and till next time. Bye.